Hello, welcome back to the Big Book Project, where we're discussing Roberto Bolaño's 2666. And I'm really pleased to have with us today a good friend, a great reader, Tom Flynn from Chicago. Hey, Tom.
Hey Lori, how's it going?
It's going good. It's going really good. We're at we can see the finish line right now with this book after 11 weeks. And I know that you have some really good thoughts about this book, and you've uh, given it some close reads in the past, and you've even seen a play based on the book. So why don't you tell us about your first experience with the book? When did you first read it and kind of how you felt about it at the time?
So yeah, I started reading Bolaño. I think only two books from New Directions were out. I think the first one I read was Distant Star, and then By Night in Chile was also available. And I was immediately smitten. And every time a new one came out, I made sure I was, if there were arcs, there weren't always arcs for us. I would snag one. But as soon as it came out, I was the first one purchasing it, and then the rest of the staff at the store knew I was useless for the rest of the day because I was probably just going to be reading it. Um, so I've been reading Bolaño. I read Bolaño obsessively in anticipation of 2666. By the time the books were coming out in English from New Directions, he was dead, and 2666 had been published. Um, and when when 2666 was about to come out from FSG, our sales rep at the time, I think this was back when they weren't even part of Macmillan yet. It was still Van Holtzbrink. But our sales rep at the time made sure that I got one of the craft copy arcs of it, which
Oh, very
I've shown to
nice.
some other booksellers, and they've gotten very like through camera only because I think they would stab me for it otherwise. But but interestingly, I put off reading it for quite some time because that was it. Nothing else is supposed to be coming out. All these books that have come out since that were discovered in his computer or in a drawer, none of that was really supposed to happen, and I wasn't at that time ready for it to end. So I read the part about the critics before the book was published to the rest of the world in English, and then I kind of stopped for a while, and then did read it. And then a few years back, I did a read of it with a couple friends over Zoom, just to kind of dig into it once more. One of them hadn't read it before, so it was just a good opportunity, and we'd done a few big books together. But yeah, I also saw a production of it that the Goodman Theater here in Chicago put on. I guess this was 2016, which seems impossible because that's not that long ago, but it feels lifetimes ago at this point. Um, but yeah, the Goodman Theater got permission or got there was some sort of agreement for them to develop it into a play, which was about a 5-hour play with at least two intermissions, if I remember correctly. And by the end, half the audience had left from a combination of exhaustion and probably terror, because it's a rough book to make into a theatrical performance.
Yeah, I can imagine just seeing it live like that performed. Even if there would be a movie treatment, it would feel, I think, a little bit less immediate than being there with live actors.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. It's interesting you bring up the movie component to it because the scene of Fate in the house, they switch from it being on stage to being projected on screen, and it turns into something that looks exactly like what you imagine a slasher film would look like,
Ugh.
with just random things in the corner that you can't quite place. What that is that a person or not? I'm blanking on her name, but Rosa's friend, like, not passed out on the couch, but pretty clearly dead on the couch. It's terrifying. At the that After that was one of the intermissions, and at that point, my sister looked at me with tears in her eyes and was like, "Does what happens to Rose? Does she show up again in the novel?" And I'm like, I mean, like we're just like so invested in it, but also so, I mean, frankly, terrified of what was being depicted there. It's a really remarkable production. I don't think anyone else has done it. And I mentioned this to you before we started. I was under the impression that the Goodman was going to have a video version of it up on their site, kind of in perpetuity, and that's not the case. But so if anyone out there knows anyone at the Goodman, higher up, maybe throw an elbow into their ribs to try and get this out there, so that I don't know, folks like us who want to have that experience over the course of a weekend can do so.
Yeah, I based upon the site that you shared with me, I got onto the theater's webpage, and they have some information about the production, and they have some video of conversations with the director and the set producer, and just a very short little like montage of clips. But yeah, there's just listening to the director talk about it, so much time and effort went in. I mean, a 5-hour live production, I can only imagine that you would think that they would want to like spread this around, and
Hmm. And
maybe
also
it's not
with
too late.
with a very small cast, lots of people playing multiple parts, recurring throughout, and that also had its and it's just a very smart production. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of ways to critique it and to analyze it, and it's too distant for me now to really really go after that. That's not the point of this conversation. But it was really well done. I mean, it's frankly disappointing that it's not as readily available. Hopefully, there's a way for that to happen someday. But before we move back into the book, one really fun little anecdote about this production, when it hadn't I think it was the day of its premiere. I had a ticket to see it like a month or so whatever later. I was supposed to meet a friend for a drink, and I get to the place where we're meeting up, and I mean, at this juncture I have three small kids, and so like peeling away for a drink is like, okay, I'm going out for a drink, I have this amount of time, all that. I get there, and he always beats me to wherever we're going. And he wasn't there. And then he continued to not be there. And he continued to not be there. And then I finally get a text from him going, "Oh my God, I am so sorry. I'll tell you why I'm not there another time." Like, okay, that's interesting. So this friend had written quite a bit about Bolaño and about his work. Some really good appreciations. He's even mentioned in one of the Wikipedia entries on 2666, I think, and his criticism. And he got a call the day before inviting him to the premiere and to dinner beforehand, where he met Bolaño's son, and got to
Wow.
see it on the first night and all those cool things. So that was, that was neat. That was a good reason to miss us grabbing a drink that evening, I think.
You forgave him.
Yeah, very much so.
All right. So, do you remember how you thought when you finished this book the first time?
I was thinking about that earlier, that actually up until the reread with my friends, the play had kind of done a bit of an overwrite on a lot of my, perception of the novel. Like, I mean, I see Fate looking like that actor, I the Amalfitano's movements are like grafted onto me from how he was portrayed on stage. Um, I remember I do remember reading the part about the critics when I first got the arc, and thinking this is one of the cleverest, most devastating takedowns of academic literary culture I'd read. That and but also laying bare something really vital about it too, in that way that Bolaño can simultaneously rip something apart, but also show why it's a thing in the first place, and why it might matter at the same time. Um, but yeah, I think, but it's also the case, and I think in your posts, this is reflected, and in some of the community posts, it's also a really hard book. I mean, part by part, it's hitting you in different ways and asking you different questions. And by the time you get to the part about the crimes, I mean, that's where my wife fell off of the book. She's never finished it. She couldn't get through that part. And if she couldn't get through that part, she didn't want to move on to the next part. And I know a lot of people for whom it's even a non-starter of a novel, because they simply can't address that level of violence. So It's a weird one that way. I think the first time I read the part about the crimes, I took a good break from reading it because I needed breathing space. That's just such a hard section of it's probably the hardest one of the hardest reads certainly I've ever had.
Let's maybe talk a little bit about Archimboldi, the writer and the
Mhm,
novelist. So you mentioned the part about the critics, and I think that's such a good way. It, I don't know whether it was planned out strategically, but what a great way to like start a novel where you've got just this larger than life author who's like ghosts everyone. He doesn't want to be around. He's just an enigma, and the reaction throughout the novel of different people, different scholars, different critics, different readers to Archimboldi's work is pretty remarkable. Of course, we've got the critics who, seem obsessed with him. And then you've got someone like Amalfitano, who is kind of like, yeah, he's a pretty good German writer, but I don't think he's like one of the greats, right?
mhm.
And and then you have in the last section when the publisher, Mr. Bubis, goes and talks to the critic, and he keeps like having to like prod him, like, what do you really think about Archimboldi? Like, do you like his work? Do you not like his work? And it's kind of obvious this critic really doesn't want to answer the question. And when he finally does, he's like, well, I just don't think he seems like a German writer. He seems like an African writer, or, like, um, maybe he's just not able to pigeonhole him. But do you have thoughts about what maybe Bolaño was trying to tell us about, because because I kind of see Bolaño as very much of an international writer. Sure, he's from Latin America, but he lived all kinds of places, and in Europe and other places as well. And he seems to have a very cosmopolitan type of writing, I think. So, do you think he's trying to tell us something about like what it means to be an international writer, or have an international audience to your work, or versus kind of a more parochial, uh, kind of national character?
I mean, Bolaño, before he went to, multilingual fame, was certainly one of the premier Spanish language writers. And like as you said, like, born in Chile, lived in Mexico, but mostly settled. And a lot of his writing that we have, or the writing that became famous, happened when he was in Spain. Um, so I mean, he was sort of part of this, and almost an exemplar of this. Spanish speaking world, as it were, right? So that means that automatically makes you international on some level, right? Because you're like bouncing in and out of different jurisdictions. And at the same time, Archimboldi wasn't entirely regarded until these critics decided to start holding him up. And then they found one another in a way that you kind of can through academic writing and reviewing and all that. And now you can over message boards and Substacks and things like that, where someone can go from parochial to famous in a matter of moments. So I think there is a commentary on literary fame and what that means, but at the same time, as reflected in Amalfitano and the critic, just because there is a claim for your work does not mean that everyone thinks you're deserving of it. And I think that's also an element of it. I mean, Bolaño certainly had writers that, I mean, I'm blanking on a couple of the names offhand, and maybe I don't need to like stir up those sorts of beefs, but there were writers that that were very famous that he thought very little of. And, I don't think he would dispute their fame. I don't think he would dispute that a lot of people, like them for X, Y, and Z reason, but for him, it just, it didn't work for whatever the reason might be. It could be a matter of style or content. So yeah, I think starting with the critics is also reflective of where he was in his own writing life, right? I mean, he knew who he was. He knew. I mean, he knew even before he knew he was dying what he was turning into as far as the kind of figure, and his fame in the English speaking world, I think he would have assumed was going to take place. And frankly, probably by the time he knew he was dying, he might have just assumed that that would ensure his fame. Dying and then having this body of work is in some ways a surefire way to get a lot of attention and to supercharge a career such as it is. um, so yeah, I think there are a lot of different registers that he's using there, and I think that's also kind of plays out across the novel in terms of what people value and how they express it. And also the section of the critics is really a microcosm of the kind not a microcosm, a stand-in for a lot of the power play and dynamic and violence that takes place across the rest of it. I mean, the conferences where they're going back and forth with and I apologize, the other critics, the name for the other group of critics that like Archimboldi, but they use a different critical lens to address him. It's described as warfare. It's a skirmish here, a battle there. They pushed us back, but then we stormed the barricades. And that's when we get to the part about the crimes. Even before then, when we get into the subsequent portions and the real world violence that people are living with, the idea of using that kind of language to describe literary critical fights is kind of grotesque, and I think that's part of what he was doing there too.
Do you feel like there's any heroes in this book?
Hmm. That's a tricky question, because if you say there are no heroes, then can there be villains, or can you have villains without heroes, right?
I don't myself know the answer to my question, or
Yeah.
what I think about it, but it just something about what you were just saying just kind of struck me.
You know,
There
I think there are monsters all over this book. I think there are a lot of monsters. I think there are a lot of dragons to be there that are in need of slaying. I think there are heroic acts. I think Malfitano, and his getting Rosa out, and Fate and his getting Rosa out. That's a heroic action. A lot of the folks who are doing what they can to push back are those are acts of those are heroic acts, especially within the context of Santa Teresa and how easy it is to simply disappear. Um, but like a out and out hero. And it's funny you mentioned that, because, and this is a bit of a failing on my part. I have meant to read Parzival by Eschenbach since von Eschenbach since my second read through, or the read through with in the book group I did. Because I it got it in my head that Archimboldi reading Parzival when he did kind of sets the course for the novel. Like it's this chivalric tale moving towards greater and greater spiritual awakening. It's a grail quest. It's all these things, and it's in some ways Archimboldi's movement through life. And this is depicted in the play as periodically, like, just the light changes and it looks like he's walking on the seafloor with anemones floating up around him, and seaweed and all that. But like this sort of fabulous element to what's ultimately a very straightforward tale of someone sort of like born after World War I, surviving World War II, and moving through this post-war Europe, and becoming a writer over time. Um, I don't know. I feel like there's something about Parzival and that hope for a hero or a heroic journey, a heroic arc to your life that is also playing out. And so I've been meaning to read Parzival precisely to kind of dig into it a little bit and see like where it is. And I'm Lori. This book has been out forever. It's been studied by a million people. I'm quite confident that I could probably find like 5 graduate essays about this. I just haven't bothered, because I also feel like that'd be leaning on the critics too much, maybe. Um, but yeah, I don't. Yeah. So anyway, long way going. I don't know that there are heroes. I do think that there is heroism in this novel.
How do you think he achieves all these different registers in the book? because there is genuine horror in every of the 5 parts of this novel. Certainly, the most is the part about the crimes, but even the last part that we're reading right now, the part about Archimboldi, you've got that crucifixion of the general. I mean, there's just a lot of horrible stuff, but yet there's also parts that are just really funny. And
Mhm.
so, I mean, maybe I'm just asking you to, like, put a star on top of Bolaño's brilliance, but I don't know. Maybe you've got some. Do you think it was intentional? Do you think that maybe he felt when he was writing this, like, oh my God, this is all so heavy. Like, I have to do something to lighten this up a little bit from time to time.
Well, so I think to start, the easy answer is he's a genius and he just can
Yes.
do whatever he wants. I mean, he probably could have been the greatest sci-fi or horror or mystery novelist of the last half century, right? Like that's his skill level when it comes to every element of writing. And he also read everything. I mean, the his between parentheses, which if folks haven't picked up, is a collection of his nonfiction, and in it there are a lot of very very short, almost portraits, not even portraits, like miniatures of other writers. I mean, he assesses Walter Mosley. He like goes through a lot of the Latin and South American writers, but he read everybody and everything, and I think that really informs his ability to move from register to register, from style to style. And I've never looked too deeply into the ins and outs of how he wrote this. You know, did he really like, hit each part and then go back through, or was he writing a lot of parts simultaneously? I've often thought that it was something closer to a simultaneous reading, or writing rather. um because I don't know how you write the parts about the crimes, the part about the crimes or fate or any of those, and not lose your mind. I know that there's been like commentary about like what toll did this take on him. I, I don't know. Who knows? Um, but I do think being able to move from one part to another part back and forth, and also see how they're talking to each other, at least even in his own head, that part makes sense to me. He also was working on this for a very long time while he's writing other things too. I mean, it's it's one of those questions. There's a way in which he's the kind of writer where you wonder almost, when did he have the time to actually live enough to be able to create all of this? And he lived a lot as a young man, but how he continued to do so in order to generate this much. So that's kind of how that's in my head anyways. That's my head canon on how he managed to pull this off, because I don't really know how you do that otherwise, quite frankly.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things that I've been thinking about reading this, and this is just my second time with the group reading it. I'd read it when it first came out. Um, but the 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 sections aren't like chronological. Like they don't stack on top of each other. Like things are happening in the part about the critics at the beginning that happened, like months before, years before, actually, like the part about fate. And the same with, like, of course, when Archimboldi's like, we're getting like his history as Hans Reiter before he became Archimboldi. But then, of course, we know that the book ends where he's about ready to get on a plane and uh, go to Santa Teresa. And in the first part, Pelletier, the critic, is already says, like, I feel he's here. He's here. I know that Archimboldi is here in Santa Teresa, and we'll never be this close to him again. So we're staying. Um, so yeah, it just seems like a really tricky thing to do, no matter what his writing process would have been, to kind of think about the timelines for these different stories and how they work together. And I think they don't really line up, but somehow they work together well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bolaño's always his works always have a real sense of how the world's very messy and how it's almost so many realities intersecting with one another, which means that, like, different interpretations of events. I don't think he's pushing back against an idea of objective truth per se, but I think he does get how human experience is really fractured, and we make meaning out of that fracture, out of what we recognize as not fitting. We have to make fit in some capacity, and mentioning what Pelletier said, I do remember, on initial reads, or even almost every time I read it, I feel like every time that's sort of a jab at, you bring what you read with you everywhere. So of course he's there, but no, he's also actually probably there, which is, just Bolaño like winking at you at the same time, right? Um, and I actually, like, circling just back on what he did before and how he's able to, the crucifixion scene, all that. One of the things that Bolaño knew well was horror, right? Like, he understood and was witness to a lot of the horror of this world, and I think he had an ability in his writing to really reflect on that and bring it out and put it in a way that it doesn't seem impossible that would have happened, right? It isn't magical realist, but it's just pushing on the edges of what we want, what we accept reality to be, what is acceptable within reality. And he's constantly pushing and poking at that. And then you get the part about the crimes, which is based on reality. And he's really, really challenging the reader to actually face up to the horror that is present. And we the least we can do the least we can do is do something, but even before that we have to look, and I think that's part of what that part is about.
Do you think the part about the crimes, um, a lot of the book, I think, and as I understand, I haven't read all of his work and not as much as you have, but a lot of his work, I think, is a commentary on this idea that we become numb to all the horrible things that are happening. Um, but I wonder if there's an argument that, like, this piling up of the part about the crimes, it's horrible, and maybe the experience that you said that your wife had where she just had to stop reading it. I'm contradicting myself by asking this question, but do you think we become numb after a while reading those descriptions over and over and over again?
I mean, my experience, and talking to my wife at the time, her experience was that, yeah, you do numb out, and then you're shocked out of that numbness again, right? I mean, there are vast swaths of it that are almost just repetition of insert name, body found here. You almost start creating a mental map of Santa Teresa based off of where the body dumps happen, right? Or where someone was last seen. So you get a sense of, like, where, the what was it? The attractors are within the object attractors, or whatever the term he used was, the dense gravity. But then there will be a passage that absolutely rips your heart out or chills you to the bone. The two little girls. Um, that's the one that always is just stuck in my head. So yes, I do think that effect was intended to numb you out, but I think he also intended to shock you out of that numbness repeatedly. And it is a challenge. It's both just a straight up challenge, but I think it's also a challenge from him of, can you keep not can you keep going, because it's not like that, because that makes it almost like a dare, and it's not that. It's much more a challenge of just keeping your eyes open to what's taking place here. And frankly, like, you're this far into this novel that is what it is, right? So are you going to keep going and find out and keep going and see how he wraps it up? Like, is that going to be an option? um I don't know. It's hard. It's tricky. I do think that publishing it as one piece is exactly the right choice. I think that I don't think that almost anyone would get through part 4 if it was not part of this larger novel. Even if it was, okay, here's part 4 out, 6 months later. No, people are going to put it down and move on with their day. Um, but I also think that you lose some of those resonances, those connections across the various digressions, across the characters that appear and disappear, if you don't read it as one mammoth thing, you know?
Yeah. Speaking of the idea of heroes and that scene that you just mentioned about the two young girls that are found dead and it turns out they were tortured. And Juan de Deos, the detective or the inspector, I underlined that passage where he said, and in that second, everything changed. And I so wanted him to be like, you know, okay, this is we're not putting up with this anymore. Like I'm taking this all over. This police department is going to burn down. This government's going to burn down. I don't care. We're solving this, but I mean, it's real, right? That doesn't happen.
Yeah, no, it's hopefully you can't hear my dog above me.
No.
You remember this from our days of
Yes.
recording. The other thing, the male person shows up and my dog decides to lose his mind. Um, yeah, I remember that line, and it's bracing, right? And then it breaks your heart because it doesn't really change it, and it's and I think also the way you kind of move in and out of Santa Teresa and the violence is there and the violence is kind of talked about, and then you get a front row seat to so much of it in different ways, and then it kind of moves back into the background. I mean, the other implication, and the reality is it's continuing. Even after the novel's gaze shifts away from it and shifts to other horrors and other violence in the world, the violence in Santa Teresa continues. It doesn't, maybe it gets quieter, maybe they get better about covering it up, maybe they start to care about covering it up, but it's it's clearly a systemic breakdown of what is and isn't acceptable to do to women in a society. And it's all the way through the society. It's top to bottom. That is, I think, what he's attacking. And it's there, whether we're reading about the crimes or not. The part about the crimes is bigger than this book, right? Which is horrifying, but is also, I think, something that I'm always very reluctant to say what authors want you to take away from a thing. I don't, and also, like, me, I don't totally care entirely about authorial intent per se, but if those things are at play here, I do think that Bologna would want, you know, or how about this way? I want you to come away from it knowing that this is continuing and that needs to be reckoned with somehow.
Yeah. I the overwhelming theme of and the portrayal of the misogyny and the treatment of women, down from like just disrespecting them to raping and mutilating them. I was I'm glad that there are at least two strong women in the book, though, that I can think. Well, maybe three actually. Um, there's Liz Norton, of course, which of all of the critics, I think she's the one that, like, I don't know, has her shit together, right? Like she's just kind of like a little bit less no nonsense than the guys. She calls a spade a spade. She kind of like controls like which one of them is going to be her lover and how that all happens. And then the Baroness.
Hmm.
She also is, I think, a very powerful woman, and I'm really glad. I was going to say as the third, although I'm taking that back. I was going to say Elvira Campos, who is Juan de Deos's lover,
Hmm.
but I I don't think she's a very strong character because she just seems to have this like obsession about like her aging skin while women are getting murdered like all around her, and she's hearing about that and she just wants to talk to him. I mean, he's dealing with that and she wants to talk to him about like herself. It just doesn't seem like a very empowering thing. But I am glad that not all women are just like victims in this book,
Hmm.
I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean it's it would certainly change the tenor of it significantly if that were the case, right? Um, I think Liz in particular is I think Liz in particular is interesting, and well, I guess she and the Baroness have something similar in that, as you point out, in terms of choosing which who's her lover. And but within the context of the critics, I don't know. I've often felt that yes, Liz is making her career with Archimboldi and as part of this set, but and she's curious about all of it, but I don't ever feel like she's quite as obsessed with finding him as the men are. The men are trying to they're trying to solve they're trying to solve existence through Archimboldi. They're trying to figure out the meaning of their lives through this writer that they've never met, who barely anyone knew until they brought him to prominence. I mean, in some ways they're justified. You could read it as a justification of everything they've done, and finding him is like the last piece of the puzzle. And it's interesting to her, but it isn't necessary, which is why she's able to leave and they're stuck there. And as they're stuck there, they're in a, when they go to Santa Teresa, that that city feels like it's in a miasma for the critics, like there's just something about the tone of it. The air feels heavy, and look, Santa Teresa doesn't feel great in any of the other parts where it's featured, but there's something really odd about that place for the critics when they're there. And I think that's also part of why Liz got out. She's like, she recognized that this ain't good, and so best to move on. Whereas they haven't finished proving something, and so they have to stick.
And maybe they're still there.
I mean, I don't think they left. I don't see how they would have left. I think one of them is probably teaching at the university. The other one, they probably they live together. One of them is constantly at the bar, and they switch off. Like who's actually supporting the other one's bar bill at a given time. I don't think, and maybe that's also a sharp little elbow from Bolaño. I don't think that this obsession with a writer and with criticism does amazing things for most of them, right? Specifically those two.
Yeah. I think that you're right though about Liz because I remember early on when we're first introduced to her, and I can't think of exactly how Bolaño says it, but um, she picks up like the Archimboldi studies kind of like as, oh well, I need to do something like, or like, yeah, this is just kind of what I selected to specialize in, whereas the guys seem to be like they're drunk on the Archimboldi wine, like they they're looking for an obsession and they find it in him.
Yeah, it's when she's first introduced that I think really kind of establishes her relationship to them, and at this and to Archimboldi, and at this point the others have all been kind of like their connection, how they get obsessive about it. But her discovery of Archimboldi was the least traumatic of all and the least poetic. During the 3 months that she lived in Berlin in 1988, when she was 20, a German friend loaned her a novel by an author she'd never heard of. The name puzzled her. Keeps going, keeps going. The novel was The Blind Woman, and she liked it, but not so much that it made her go running out to buy everything else that Benno von Archimboldi had ever written. And then she becomes this critical she becomes the sun that the rest of these critics obsessed with Archimboldi are circling, right? And but she's the one that probably cares about Archimboldi as such the least.
Yeah. Another pretty strong woman, I guess, is Lottie, Archimboldi's sister
Hmm.
and Klaus's mother. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts on her?
I mean, I feel I get the feeling in some ways I feel like Bolaño's doing a lot of different things in that section, but I think he's depicting how someone I mean, he depicts how Archimboldi survives and becomes who he becomes. And then he shifts gears very dramatically to discuss how Ryder's younger sister survives and how she makes her way through the world and what her life is like. And the kinds of choices that she makes in order to survive and to live. And yeah, and then after discovering that her son is in prison for murder, she travels as an older woman to Mexico to see him, finds her brother through absolute happenstance after decades practically at this point, I believe, and calls for him to come and makes the connection of how this giant that Klaus is seeing is him because that's how she described him because she was the younger sister. Um, yeah, she's interesting. She's one I need to spend a little more time thinking or reread again the section with Lottie and give it some more thought. But I think you're right. I think she's quite a strong character. Um, Especially given how little of this massive novel she actually occupies. Though, of course, in many ways, she occupies a whole swath of it because of the kid that she has, right?
Yeah.
Like those connections.
So, in our kind of 5 minutes or so remaining, Tom, what do you think kind of stays with you about this book, other than, of course, the part about the crimes? That's impossible to ever shed your mind of. But um, just reflecting back over the years that the book has been part of your life, um, are there any kind of, I don't know, do you have any epiphanies to share?
Oh, I don't know if I have any epiphanies. I, the thing that's the thing that always is kind of that I always go back to is what the hell is the title all about? Like that's bothered me from jump, right? There's the line in Amulet that refers back to it, that refers to it. Um, I was told that the big event for this title when it came out in New York that had Natasha Wimmer and Francisco Goldman in it, they discovered they both pronounced it. They said the title differently. Um, Goldman always said 2666, and Wimmer said 2666. And they're like, well, there's no reason that either one of us is wrong or either one of us is right. Um, I think, and I also think that the ambiguity of the title, especially when none of his other titles do this. All of his other books are very straightforward. Like the title, it gives you an idea of what you're getting into. Like it at the very least refers back to what's happening in there. But 2666, and the fact that he talked about it all the time, it makes me feel like there's something to unlock. And that also makes me think that he was just screwing with everybody. That like he knew it would make everyone think there was something to unlock. Um, and in talking to you about it, I'm realizing that I'm reacting to this novel in a way that maybe I didn't a few years ago. That with you don't read in a vacuum, and so thinking about what this book is doing, what it's perhaps saying, what he's trying to say, and on this day, March 17th, happy St. Patrick's Day, by the way, Lori, um, March 17th, 2025. um, I, Bolaño, I think, had a very specific consideration of and interest in figuring out violence and figuring out how violence and the madness that allows for it to take place, how it spreads. And I think that has made this specific novel evergreen in the sense that it's always happening and we're always having to reckon with it and always trying to figure out what that means and what we have to do about it. Um, I think the Amalfitano's idea of the idea that madness is a virus. Madness can spread, and it can spread on the wind, and the wind's blowing through Santa Teresa and all that. Those images really stick with me, and right now, um, they're it's an image that I think about a lot, quite a bit.
Yeah, I was considering thinking about our discussion this morning. I was trying to predict how the book would be different if Bolaño were writing it today. Um, and I would just, and I was thinking this as I was on the treadmill watching CNN, and the deportation of 300 people back to Venezuela, um, allegedly part of a gang. But I would have to think, even though the drugs are present in 2666, I don't think that you could do this book today without like the whole opioid trade and that becoming, you've got the narcos in the part about the crimes, and they're obviously, influencing and in some ways directing what happens. But I don't know, you're disagreeing with me a little bit.
Yeah, I am kind of disagreeing. I think for Bolaño, the narcos are as much a element of the system as they are a driver. Like the system is an intricate machine. It's a terrible beast, right? But the system isn't just the narco trade or the violence against the women. I mean, those are all, as much as they're elements of it, they're also symptoms of it. I mean, what changed Santa Teresa was NAFTA, right? Like all of a sudden, all these factories pop up, and the entire social order changes. All these women don't have to, like, can make livings, can be independent, and that sends shockwaves through a society that was not ready for it in any way. Um, and you even see that though with the competition over Liz, right? Like among these critics, they've all decided that she's the ideal woman, and they're jockeying for position as if she's a prize and not their colleague and their friend. um so I don't I mean, so maybe on the margins it alters a bit. Maybe like tariffs actually like would be a thing that he could like throw into it a little bit. But I think that he has a pretty good bead on the ugliness that the system, the economic, political, social system that we live under, what it can produce, and how it can go from not great to really, really bad in a matter of time, and how it doesn't have to stop being that way. And even good people, who say that this is the moment everything changed, can't necessarily change it. You know, so I mean, that's kind of why I feel like it's I, evergreen. I think he kind of nailed a lot of what he's talked about in his other books, and a lot of the ways he's gone at it, from Distant Star and the colonel. I think it was a colonel, who is also a serial killer, functionally operating in Chile. Nazi literature in the Americas. Like he was mapping how political systems move and infect one another and alter and change. And he had what most of the world treated as a grand experiment, in the history of South America, throughout the last half of the 20th century, to pick and choose his topics and to address how he wanted. I mean, even the skating rink is basically, I mean, in some ways, is simply about basic corruption and civic government. I mean, as much as it is other things. So I don't know. I think I don't know that today's events really would alter the book too terribly much, because I don't think they would especially surprise him, and I don't think that they're really much more than reflective of what he was already talking about. Which, man, Lori, we have to work on how we end our conversations, because I feel like almost every time we're leaving the listeners with a real bummer, man.
I know, but as much as the book is about injustice and the intractability and the pervasiveness of injustice, this book ends with ice cream.
Yes. Yes, it does.
So,
Which, I mean, I think that's well, I mean, a couple of thoughts on that. I think that's Bolaño absolutely. I mean, I'd already mentioned like him throwing a sharp elbow at the critics, but could you imagine what all those critics, especially the two that stay behind, Espinoza and why am I
uh,
blanking on the French one's name?
Pelletier.
Pelletier, yes. Espinoza and Pelletier. If they found out the last thing that Archimboldi did in Germany before he traveled to Santa Teresa was sit on the bench and eat ice cream, and not just ice cream. Ice. This is a real ice. This is a real ice cream treat that exists. That's named after what someone who is now an obscure botanist. Their brains would explode, and they would have like 4 conferences that they could construct simply around this single action, which is simply the dude's having an ice cream treat before he boards a plane to Mexico to just and that's also life, right? Like it's not always beauty and joy, and it's not always horror, and sometimes it's just having an ice cream and talking to someone about a pretty tasty ice cream and why you should ice cream treat and why you should have an ice in the summer and an ice cream in winter. And I, I keep talking about like all these like the social justice element and the assessment of the systems and all that, but Bolaño painted lives. Like he in his books, he brought characters to life, and life is not just the highs and lows. Life is very messy, and life is very interesting, and life is full of moments, and that's why there are digressions. That's why, hell, that's why he wrote his buddy Frazan into this one. And
Right,
that's why he did all these things, because he knew it would probably make Rodrigo smile. Right? He knew it was a thing he could do, and he could do it because the world is so much bigger than any book could ever be. So
it's a good way to end it, Tom. Well, thank you for joining us. I'm so happy. It's always great to talk books with you, and I hope you'll come back to the big book project. We've got some good books lined up.
yeah, I was eyeing. I don't know if I can jump in on the next one because I've got a few work things that are cropping up, but I definitely will be hopping in to, if not the one, maybe I'll make time for the next. Maybe the next one will be the solution to my time constraints on reading. I'll just read that only. But yeah, thank you for having me, Lori. This is fun. We definitely need to do this more often.
I agree. Thanks, Tom.